welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and literary professionals about books, publishing, and the writing life. I'm Kelley Vick. I'm the host of the program, and in just a moment, it will be my pleasure to introduce today's guest. But first, a reminder that if you like what you hear, please do take a moment to subscribe. It helps us out, and you can make sure you never miss an episode. Also, we've opened a Literary Prospects shop, so if you're looking for bookish shirts, totes, and gifts, please check that out at literaryprospects.etsy.com. And to grab books featured on the podcast and check out more curated book lists, you can visit the Literary Prospects bookstore on bookshop.org. We'll leave all those links below in the show notes. And now, let's introduce today's guest. Suzanne Park is a Korean-American writer who was born and raised in Tennessee. She's the author of Loathe at First Sight, So We Meet Again, The Do-Over, and most recently, One Last Word. As a stand-up comedian, Suzanne appeared on BET, was the winner of the Seattle Sierra Mist comedy competition, and was a semifinalist in NBC's Stand Up for Diversity Showcase. Suzanne graduated from Columbia University and received an MBA degree from UCLA. She lives in Los Angeles with her family. Suzanne Park, thank you for joining today to talk about your brand new novel, One Last Word. Elle magazine says One Last Word is a jaunty, quick read that's no less captivating for its ease. The stuff early aughts rom-coms were made of, updated for a more modern decade. New York Times bestselling author Rachel Lynn Solomon says, with Suzanne Park's irresistible humor and lovably relatable characters, One Last Word is a breezy, clever romp through the tech world. I can't count the number of times I laughed out loud. And bestselling author Camille Pagan says, One Last Word is the best kind of novel. Laugh out loud funny, bittersweet, and so darn relatable, you wonder if the author's been hanging out inside your head. Suzanne Park has written another absolute winner. So with that, what can you tell us about One Last Word?
One Last Word follows Sarah Che. She develops an app called One Last Word. It's actually called Upon My Death, but then they changed it to One Last Word. But the reason why it's called Upon My Death at first is because the app lets you send out your final messages to whoever you want once you pass. And so when another Sarah Che dies and the obituary is posted online, Sarah's drunkenly drafted messages that she wrote to her ex-best friend, her overbearing parents, and her unrequited crush from high school, Harry Shim, they all get released. And then she has to deal with the aftermath once everything goes chaotic. And she's also applying for a venture capital mentorship. And of course, the mentor that she is matched with is who else but Harry Shim, the guy she sent those messages to.
What a premise. An app that sends your final thoughts to people after you depart.
Yes.
And it misfires and chaos ensues. How did this one come to you? How did this idea get started?
This one was a little bit more like I had various experiences or interests, and they all kind of converged to come up with this idea. So one of the things that that influenced it was that I typically in my adult books just focus my stories on male dominated workplaces. So my first book focused on video games, the video game industry. The second one was investment banking. The last one was STEM, somebody that is an author who ends up in the STEM world. And then this one, I felt like venture capital was the next thing that I wanted to talk about, because the more I read about challenging workplaces for women, this industry always came up. I just wasn't sure how to tackle it. So it took a few tries at figuring out, like maybe I'll write a little bit and I'll sit on it. But when I was during the pandemic, when I was thinking about this idea, I had watched a lot of Shark Tank during the pandemic. So between that and then watching To All the Boys I Loved Before, and then reading a lot of memoirs and talking to a lot of women for my previous books, I really started the idea for this book really crystallized because I was trying to find a way that I can talk about venture capitalism in a way that because a lot of people may not know how toxic it is for women in tech, and so I just wanted to have a way to talk about it. And because I have a comedy background, it was I had to do it delicately. So
Mhm.
figuring that out was the hardest part. Is like, how can I talk about all this where it talks about the very reality of some, venture capital world where um, so many there it's just male, it's not even just male dominated, it's like 2% of VC funding finds its way to women, and that's just
Wow.
absurd, right?
Yeah.
And then fewer than 5% of venture capital partners are female, so it's just an industry that's just not set up for women to succeed, and I knew that that was something I wanted to write about eventually.
And you spent some time working in big tech. Is that
Yeah.
correct? You have personal experience sort of in this area.
Yes, I have worked at some large companies and have had experiences myself about just how it can be working with certain types of people. And it's not necessarily like men are like this. There's just certain people who work in tech that have personalities that are not very short-sighted. So
Mhm.
I, I don't know how often I tell the story, but I remember one of the last things that happened to me in the workplace was I was in marketing, but they kept having me work in product management because um, I kind of understood like how our product could be developed and I had a brain for it, but
Mhm.
I wasn't technically hired to do that. I would just kind of help out when I saw gaps, but then that became something they expected out of me. So I remember being in a meeting and saying like, well, the product team is all here. And then I get assigned by the COO an assignment, and it was a product feature assignment. And I was like, well, you have 5 people here whose job it is actually to develop and research this. I just want to be clear that you are assigning this project to me, the marketing person, and not the product team. And the director of product is here, the VP of product is here. And she literally said, I have assigned this to you. And I was like, well, we have a different conversation. Anyway, I developed this insane spreadsheet that is just very robust, features, all the research I'd done, prioritization, and I sent it off to the product team for them to take a look because I am a team oriented person.
Mhm.
No comments. I find out later that there is a meeting the following week, and I was on the invite, but like as a FYI, not to be in the meeting. There
Mhm.
was a link to a Google document, and I click on it, and it's my spreadsheet in Google spreadsheet form. Mine was in Excel. Somebody had uploaded the identical thing, and all they did was added different color coding, just like very cosmetic touches, and they
Mhm.
were presenting it in the meeting
Wow. As their own
as their own.
work?
The product team, yes.
Wow. Wow.
Right, right. And I remember thinking, I'm going to shelve this. One day I'll write about something like this
Yeah.
because this is not fair.
Infuriating, but also great material.
Yes, yes, it provides a lot of comedy for that. And I remember asking on the fly, like to my friends, should I mess up the document while they're in it? Because I could see all their icons at the top. And technically, they did not even secure it. So they were like, don't be petty. You can get your you'll have your say another time. And I said, okay, fine, I'll close out. And then I remember giving notice soon thereafter. But that's the sort of type of inspiration I will say that drives me to write these types of stories.
And you've also said with this particular book that the memoirs of Ellen Pao and Susan Fowler, um, both women in big tech who publicly took a stand against systemic misconduct in VC. and tech were inspirations for the book. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. Both books cover the toxicity. Ellen Powell's book was Reset, and I remember reading that early in the pandemic. And when she talks about how she had to deal with that, both on the sort of the company side, but also on the VC side, I realized it really was everywhere. And these Me Too allegations back in
Mm-hmm.
2017, fast
Mm-hmm.
forward to now, I was trying to compare the times. It's been 7 years, how much has changed. And while there have been some policies and things updated that is a little bit more transparent in terms of reprimands and ways to handle this internally with HR, still it's not in a good place. So I remember thinking like I'm going to keep reading these books and keep researching and just make sure that by the time this book releases, it's still very relevant and it's accurate. And I was still shocked to see how bad the toxicity is, and that what they were talking about still existed, but maybe in different forms or just in different ways. But the overt might be not as apparent, but I think a lot of women are still dealing with these things. They're just more of microaggressions might and macroaggressions in the workplace that are still there. So it was still infuriating to read that,
Yeah.
and to see that the numbers hadn't changed. Again, I was also looking at VC back then, VC now, just to see if the numbers had changed at all in terms of who gets funding, how much funding people get, have the partnerships changed. I do see the one big change that I have seen is that there are more and more um, women-owned
Mm-hmm.
VC firms, and
Mm-hmm.
those are tailored to um, women-owned companies, and so that has kind of leveled the playing field a bit. But that really is the most major change that I've seen as far as numbers and how that's been addressed. It's almost like the system is broken, so let's just supplement it with other
Mm-hmm.
types of ways to solve for it.
And in addition to these issues with big tech and VC, One Last Word also explores complicated family relationships, especially for first generation Americans. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yes. So my parents, of course, are a bit of an influence here.
Yeah.
I try to balance like my own personal experiences, but also others outside of my own experiences. The more stories I write, the more I feel like I need to go outside of my own world and tell stories of the broader diaspora. But
Mm,
when I was thinking about this particular challenge that Sarah has, she's upset by the fact that she just has a lot of in general conflict avoidance, and then dealing with her parents who have certain expectations for her. She's 34 and she still feels this pressure.
mm,
And what I explore in this book that I haven't done in others is just to have her thoughts just laid out in a message that she didn't expect to send, but then it becomes what she really thinks out there, and then her parents have to deal with it. By the end of the story, there is more resolution in terms of the parents acknowledging her side more. But the thing that I did mention in this book that I feel like I haven't seen discussed very often is the fact that when people come to the States, for whatever reasons, from another country, so sometimes the narrative that we're told as second generation children is that this was all a sacrifice for you. But if you
mm.
think about it, you weren't necessarily, a lot of the people who have heard this weren't born then, or so the idea that this is all for you is like, you didn't know if you were going to have me, so I understand in theory what this means, but in actual thinking about it, um I think you did this move for you. And then I think
Mm,
you should just, I just wanted to sit with that thought where there was this acknowledgement that maybe the narrative isn't exactly as it's told to us, that there is more to it. And then while I don't have like this absolute, like, let's hold hands and run off into the sunset as a big happy family, at the end of the story, there is more positive progress in the relationship. And I
Mhm.
feel like um, having conversations like that are difficult. And as I've gotten older, I have more difficult conversations with my parents, knowing full well they can't kick me out of the house, or or know that there aren't really these same repercussions as there were when I was living under their roof. So
Mhm.
I think I've been thinking more about that, of like, what do I want to actually tell them and how can they actually change versus me just venting or something. So most of the conversations I do have with them is just sort of explaining, like, how I felt and how it was to grow up um, in in their household and with their high expectations, and talk about them. I mean, it's I get the question a lot, is are your parents proud of you of just writing these books and
Mhm.
telling your stories? And for me, I didn't know how they would receive it, honestly, because it was not following any path that they had laid out before me as, you have three choices, and you got to pick one, or you'll be disowned. No, but but it was pretty limited, and the fact that I would go outside of that was already, a not, in their mind, not something that their children should do. They should listen to them. And so
Mhm.
the further I went out, especially more and more creative fields, they were really uncomfortable. But when the book came out and they had a physical book and they saw it in a bookstore, it
Mhm.
all clicked. And I think they understood that what I was trying to do. And while they didn't really steer me in that direction, I can see that they support me now.
And you have an MBA from UCLA. So going back to talking about, these paths that were sort of laid out for you maybe, or expected of you. How did that work? How did you come to writing? Have you always written, or how do you go from your MBA to successful author?
I've always had this struggle with left brain and right brain, where they're
Mhm.
not in a place where I could find necessarily a meeting of the two, where I have this job or this outlook on life where I can put the worlds together and say, oh, this works so seamlessly. It's just,
Mhm.
they've been very extreme. So my earlier interest was humor writing, but I ended up somehow in stand-up comedy. I did that for 10 years while I was in advertising, while I was getting my
Wow.
MBA degree. And it was just such a, it's not like these worlds overlap in any way. And I remember when I was performing one night at 1 in the morning, it was a late night set at the Laugh Factory. They had like a midnight show or something. And I was there and I was in school. And I remember this comedian. He's now pretty famous. It's Bobby Lee. He's in a lot of shows now, but he said to me, like, you have two choices, but you're getting to the point where you have to decide, because if you want to get good, really good at stand up, in the fact, like, try to make a career out of it, you could. But you also have your, MBA path and your, business path. And
Mhm.
I remember asking, like, which one should I do? Like, a comedian, which one I should do. And there were no answers. So I kept straddling the two forever. And I think at some point, when I realized that I didn't know if I really had set out to do stand-up comedy in the first place, I just sort of ended up there when I was dabbling in humor writing.
Mhm.
When I let that go and then started focusing on just my day job at that tech company where they stole my ideas.
Mhm.
And I had a toddler at home. It just didn't feel like I was a whole person. Then, and I started taking more writing classes, with comedy in mind. And then I ended up somehow deciding that maybe I should end up trying out writing for like writing fiction. and things that weren't necessarily the things I was taking classes for, and ended up where I am now.
That's great. Um, you say that although you now write predominantly romance and per the expectations of the genre, things need to fall into place to a certain extent for your characters. But you really endeavor to keep things realistic in your books. You don't like to make things too easy for your characters. Can you speak to your philosophy on that and how you keep it real?
Yeah. So there's a few different things I try to do in my stories. One is I definitely research a lot, and like
Mm,
98% of it doesn't even make it into the book in any way. But I just want to make sure I really, really understand the world that the main character will be living in. And
mhm,
then whether it's my own experiences or talking with people as like mini focus groups or one-on-one interviews, I hear the types of things that happen in the workplace, in their relationships, and that those sort of things just organically come out. And I take note of those because those are the things that make the characters feel very three-dimensional, like that they
mhm,
experience this themselves and how are they going to get out of it. When I spoke with my friends in the gaming industry and in investment banking, some of they're not the same stories. They were just things that happen in at work or at a convention or whatever, and I would just write them down thinking like this is great because it really is like the I can write this now so it feels like the person really is living this type of life.
yeah.
So it's always kind of funny to me when I get reviews saying like this wouldn't happen in the gaming industry. I know people in gaming, or this would never happen in real life. And I'm thinking, like, actually, so there's a story of the do-over where the main character finds out that she after applying for a job and getting a background check, she ends up um, finding out that she didn't finish her college degree, that she was missing a few credits, so she has to go back to college. And in that, I have this whole thing where she's taking a swim, has to take a swim test now to graduate. Like it was postponed, but then or a deactivated, and then sort of like becomes a thing that she has to do again. And there are a lot of comments that say like that's ridiculous for somebody to have a swim requirement in college. And I'm thinking, I had one and I looked online, and even after the pandemic, when I actually thought, oh no, these are all going away, 9 schools came back with it. And there's probably going to be more
Wow.
to add it back in. Like, why would you get rid of it for 2, 3 years and then bring it back? So I so this when I get those types of comments or reviews that I get a little frustrated because I'm thinking like actually that this is all real.
Wow.
Um, so that is the thing that I do like to do is make sure that it feels authentic. The other thing I want to do is make sure that when I do present obstacles that are seem overwhelming or almost um, that you probably can't overcome them, um, I end up trying to find solutions to the problems that the main character has to deal with that
Mhm,
is actually possible. So I know sometimes some, whether it's tropes or conventions, they just have sometimes almost a fantastical way of, solving for it, or a meet cute that just seems so coincidental that it doesn't seem possible. I try to make sure that whatever my character has to do, she has the agency to solve it on her own and get to her happy ending, and it's fully earned. And so when
mm,
I do that, I feel like I've written the story that I want to tell because I want to show my readers that this seems like it's really, really hard, but we can all do hard things. We just,
mhm.
there are ways to solve for these things. And hopefully, when I do have readers that say, this situation is a lot like mine, and you finally gave me hope.
What a great thing to hear. And I love that idea of agency and not just things happen to fall into place, but no, your characters have agency. They've done this on their own. Um, you're known for couching serious topics, some of which we've talked about already, with humor in your books. Why do you think that works?
I think that I think for a lot of people, hearing certain messages are hard to swallow, especially um, the ones that I like to focus on are societal issues.
Mm,
And I think when you hear them just spoken at you or you read about it or whatever, a lot of people don't want to see that, don't want to hear it or read it. But when I incorporate it, and I think being in stand up for 10 years helps because a lot of the time, even on stage, I would bring up these situations, but there was always some reason I was bringing it up. It wasn't just like a random thing, like I just drank a coffee today. It's just there's always like, oh, this incident happened. Let's reflect on it a little bit, and I will add humor to it. So we'll add levity, but in
Mhm,
the end, you'll see my social commentary. And so I think setting it up in a way that feels very familiar to me as I did on stage is one way that I've been able to talk about harder conversations and then present them in my books in a way that doesn't seem like I'm hitting people over the head with a club and telling them
mhm,
what they need to think. I never say like this is what you need to think. They just are seeing the perspective of the main character and going through some challenge, and they see how they're reacting to it. But then hopefully there's moments of reflection and introspection saying like, but why is this character having to deal with this?
mhm.
um, why is society set up this way? And so um, you can do it in a different way, but I choose the comedic way to do it so that it's more fun to write for me, and also
Mhm.
it's challenging. It's a challenge for me to have to write about serious things and then not feel like it's too much. And
Mhm.
so it is a fine balance of making sure there's some levity to the situation or the story, and then also making sure I get my point across.
What was the road to publication like for you? We talked about your sort of decision doing stand up and business and then choosing business and realizing that that sort of wasn't the thing and moving over into writing. So you're there and you've gotten into the writing. What from there? How did you get that first novel into the world?
I think it was a lot of circumstance. So, and market conditions, to be honest. So, one of the classes that I took that I mentioned before was in essay writing and memoir writing.
Mhm.
And I remember thinking at the time I was in my late 20s and early 30s when I was taking these types of classes. And, the assignment at the end of the class was to have, 5 essays written or whatever it was. So,
Mhm.
um, when I was writing these essays, that's when David Sedaris was popular, and Mindy Kaling and Tina Fey, they all had their essay collections out. And I thought, oh, I can do something like that because this is the first time I've seen essays that are comedy focused and also written by women, and marginalized voices. So I
Mhm.
thought, this is the time, this is the right moment. So I wrote a collection. It was on the shorter side. Wrote a pitch letter, and I think uh, there's a whole other um, story here, but probably not for this podcast. But I think the title was
Well,
something
now I'm
like
curious.
even I think it was like even Garth Brooks hates my mom or something, where it was like a hooky kind of title, and I got a lot of requests for it. But I think in the end, I what I was told is there's no central theme to your stories, like which I don't know if I necessarily agree with. It has to have. Um, but the other thing that was really pressing, like important at the time, was the fact that the people who are selling these essays aren't just random people, they're celebrities.
Mhm.
And it didn't seem like and it seemed like that market was shifting anyway, so it wasn't as popular as it used to be. So one agent was really nice enough to kind of lay it all out to me in front of me, really honestly saying, look, it's not exactly a booming market anymore, the essay market.
Mhm.
The people who are selling them are former presidents and just movie stars and rock stars. So unless you have that in your career trajectory, you might want to think about something else. However, I did read, some of your essays, and I do think there's something there. So if you wanted to fictionalize any of this, then there could be a novel, in there that you could flesh out and try to pitch, because I think that might be a better, a better fit for you.
Mhm.
And I took that to heart, and that's when I started writing my first novel.
So you write the novel, and then was it the same agent that you
No,
Mhm.
no. I look back at that email the other day saying, "Oh, who is it?" And it was a really it was somebody that was more geared toward nonfiction and memoir.
Mhm.
So it didn't
Mhm.
really make sense. And I was thinking like, "Oh, maybe she'd remember this." But um so when I ended up finishing up the novel, and it was in pretty bad shape. I joke about this, saying it was like a 300-page blog post. Yeah, no anything like anything you're supposed to have in a novel, it did not have. So I had just finished it, and within maybe a few days I was just googling, how to, you know finish a novel, how to find an agent, that sort of thing. And I came across this pitch competition called Pitch Wars.
Mhm.
And in this competition, if you submit your materials, and if a mentor or mentor pair decide to take you on, you work with them to polish your manuscript. And at the end of the competition, there's an agent round where certain agents are invited to read your excerpts. And if they are interested, they will reach out to you and request for more material. So that seemed pretty easy and contained, in that,
Mhm.
like, I could try a thing, and if it didn't work out, I totally understood why. So I submitted it, and I think you are allowed 4 different submissions, and I think only one pair got back to me. But it's funny, if you look at what they were looking for comedic mystery, that or comedic women's fiction. And I remember thinking maybe it could stretch, with my comedy, and say it's that. And I this is the first time I didn't like follow the rules and just like submit, make sure it was 100% match, which I think
Mhm.
is some people are inclined to do. Only if they're a perfect fit would they even bother applying. So this is the one time that I broke that rule, and thinking like, they'll either like my voice or they won't. And hopefully they will. And they just did say, in the end, they did want a mystery, so they did pick somebody, but I was sort of like their extra pick. And somehow that worked out well. I got my agent, and he was great. And then this book that I wrote um, did not sell. And I was very sad about that, because I felt like I had kind of hit all those steps, and I didn't realize
Mhm.
that once you have an agent, it doesn't guarantee that you would get a book sale. I thought maybe it meant you would get some kind of book sale, meaning
Yeah.
like even if it's not what you expected, could be some other way of, publishing. But it didn't kind of fall into place the way I thought it would. And so while I was on submission with that book, trying to sell that to editors, I had written the book, which was Loathe at First Sight originally.
Mhm.
And actually, that did not sell the first time around. I
Oh.
revised it to be a rom-com, and then it sold later, and actually sold after the my debut book, which was a young adult book. That was my 4th book. So I just kept trying. So I had 4 manuscripts trying to be sold, and then the 4th one sold, and then I had revised Loathe at First Sight, and then that became number 2. No, I'm sorry, that was number 2 book, and then it was the second one that sold. So it was a wild ride, actually, because there's many points where I should have probably given up by my previous cues in life, saying like, okay, third time's the charm, and then I didn't sell. So I for some reason I knew I had to do this, and so I kept trying. And then The Perfect Escape was the 4th manuscript. That was my debut YA. And then that same year, Load at First Sight released. And it was all in the pandemic. So it was 2020, early 2020, which was not the best time, but
No, but wow, just since 2020, Now, one last word is if I believe your seventh
Yes.
novel? I mean,
Yeah.
that's going pretty good in the in the
I-
last 4 years. And then to have the other manuscripts that were out, before that, how do you keep how did you keep from burning out before? But even now that, you're rolling along, how do you keep it fresh and keep going and keep from just feeling burnout?
Well, it's funny because I didn't feel it during the pandemic, but then I hit a wall after the restrictions started lifting and
Mm,
things were getting back to normal. Life was going back to the way it was before, and I felt it then because then it was, two books out, two books being written, and then it was sort of all piling up. So I remember having a very serious conversation with my agent saying, I need to slow it down because I actually cannot keep up with this. Before, I don't know what I was thinking, but at least I was like at home doing nothing. So, and everybody's in the house, so there's nothing to do. Everything was being delivered, or I would just go a short distance and drive somewhere, and then it was just very a more simple life. And then somehow I had the drive to continue writing because I think that was the only thing keeping me going and keeping my
mhm,
um motivation going was just making sure that I could be doing something, and that something happened to be writing and drafting. So come 2020, late 2022, early 2023 is when it started slowing down by design. And then actually even more recently I've had to take a few hiatuses and just take time because I think it's also um our lives have changed in the last 4 years, so I'm not certain I'm still like fully recovered from everything.
oh, yeah.
And yeah, and so even like my daughter, she's going to be going to high school next year, so it's that's a change, and I just want to make sure that I'm present. um
Mhm,
and then also, with aging parents, I also want to be present. So the
yeah.
priorities have shifted, but yeah, I think in a way that I can still balance writing in a way that's still healthy. But the thing that I do over time is I have a Google document where I dump all of my ideas, whether they're joke level, scene level, or story level. And I just, as soon as I think of something, I decide where it goes. So if it goes in
Mhm,
an email, it means it's a future idea to
mhm.
myself. I email myself. This is like if I'm just on the go. Or a text message to myself if it's the current manuscript, I just need to dump it really soon. So it's a terrible system, but it works for me. And then I have this Google Doc of all the ideas that I have. So when I think I have since 2016 when I got my agent, I think I still have like many ideas in all different genres that I just haven't gotten to yet because I haven't, much like the VC idea, like I didn't know how to do it at the time.
Mhm.
But I do know that I have some ideas that are just waiting to be told. I just need to figure out how to present them.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah. Yes. I'm happy that my ideas still come through. It is worrisome when I don't have the big story level ideas, but I do have a
Yeah.
lot. I was like, this is a silly joke. I guess I'll add that to the manuscript. It's a very line level kind of stuff. But
Mhm.
when I get the big idea, um yeah, I always try to figure out how to, where it should go. And it's not as common to get the big story ideas as the scene or the joke level or the scenario level thing. But when I do get it, it's just wonderful to update the giant spreadsheet. And then I share that document with my agent, and we just, when it's time for the new projects to come through, that's when we go mining.
Oh, that's great. What does your writing routine look like on a daily basis? Do you write every morning or do you write in spurts or how does it work for you?
So when I was working full time and had a toddler at home, I was not published. I was just trying to get words down and have some sort of routine every day. And at that time, I wrote a page a day, and it was from 10 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. at night. And I had to give up Netflix and all the streaming stuff and even reading for me to
Mhm.
be able to do that. And I did that for a year and then was able to write my first book. So, because I aim for a page a day on weekdays. Fast forward to now when I'm investing in this for more full time, I try to stick to my daughter's schedule, which is roughly 9 to 3. And so because it's not a full day, but it's very packed, I know what I need to do, and I outline it in the day before or earlier, like in my calendar, what tasks I need to do. So right now I'm in kind of ready to promote all the book stuff. And so I've been adding not just writing words, I have essays to write, but I also have to go to the post office. There's like buy stamps and there's things that I have listed that are
Mhm.
achievable. I mean, back to the whole thing of like, having achievable goals. I just make sure that I can knock these things off my to-do list, but it's not like do all the things that are not writing in one big chunk. I just make sure that I have like all the things um, that I can do and check off for that day, and then I delete it from my calendar so it's very clean at the end of the day. So that's how I manage. Again, my system is terrible.
It
Oh,
doesn't
yeah,
sound
yeah,
terrible to
texting
me. It
myself.
makes
I have
sense.
like a very weird schedule that says stuff like make sure you mail bookmarks, and for most people that would be too messy or too not how their brain works, but mine definitely does. So it works for me, and I'm able to do a lot of things during the day. But one of my prime writing hours are usually after I get all my admin stuff out of the way, like emails and
Mm.
just responding to certain notifications on social media, and then I can start writing, and then I break for lunch, and then I do resume, and then my daughter comes home. So I have it usually most days before and after lunch. I have a chunk of writing time.
Do you consider yourself a plotter or a pantser? When you're in that writing time, are you usually working off of an outline, or do you sort of just get started and explore sometimes and see where it takes you? How does that work?
It depends on the book, honestly.
Hmm.
Sometimes the book just comes out as like more free flow because I've had this idea for a long time and I just need to get it down. And then I end up
Mhm.
writing more of the book than I thought. Or um or I have some part that I want to write just to figure out the voice, and then I kind of get started and then end up deleting whatever I need to do because it's not
Mhm.
quite right. But overall, I've ended up sort of with this hybrid. I think early on I was mostly a pantser. And I
Mhm.
know people say, "Oh, I'm a converted plotter," or and they have their
Mhm.
reasons, but I'm not still not convinced that's the way for me. Says the person who texts and emails themselves. But for my purposes, um, I have to have a pitch, and I have to have because of like contractual requirements, I end up having
Mhm.
to write a synopsis now, and I use that as sort of a loose outline, and that's how I end up kind of where I am with my books now. But
Mhm.
I would say maybe half the time something veers off of whatever that synopsis is that I turned in, and I had to explain, oh, I ended up changing the scene, or this is flip flopped, and now, this
Mhm.
happens earlier or later. And they're usually pretty forgiving about that. But yeah, so I use the synopsis usually as a rough outline, and that's how I've been kind of planning out my books. But I think I'm most comfortable with that in retrospect, because I know at the beginning when I wrote my 300-page blog, it was a challenge. There was one book that I wrote, The Christmas Clash,
Mhm.
that I wrote more like um, a flow chart because I wanted
Wow.
to try that out where I had different storyline subplots, and I
Mhm.
wanted to make sure that with each scene there was some sort of reason that the scene existed. Move the plot
Mhm.
along, move the story, the characters arc into a different place. And so for that book, I had this odd kind of flow chart that's went down, and I had the family thing, the relationship and the actual story that was, the challenge that the main character was going through at the time. And doing that was interesting because I was kind of writing as I was going, but I needed to make sure I knew where the story was headed with
Mhm.
each new thing that I wrote. So it was still kind of following this thread of logic, but it was not the actual, like an actual outline or anything, but it was still planning. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So it was just a few beats ahead, and that worked for that book. So I'm all over the place.
I like that, and I really like the idea of the flow chart, like, a little bit of foresight, I guess, into where you're but not, fully dictated, to the point that you don't feel artistically free
Yes.
as
And
you're
for the most part, I try to have the big milestones for the book planned out in my head where I know how the book will start. I usually end up 50% of the time move like making that first scene, either deleting or moving it because I
Mhm,
whatever I write just isn't exactly where it needs to start. So that's one thing that I usually tell authors and prospective writers is sometimes you keep rewriting and writing, like, you want to make the thing perfect, but sometimes it's not actually where the story's supposed to start, so you're kind of wasting your time.
mhm,
And I
mhm.
say that from experience. um
Yeah.
but I try to have the beginning scenes figured out, the inciting incident, what will kick the story off in a comedic way for me.
Mhm,
I want to make sure the middle isn't kind of a slow, muddy area. So I try to make sure whatever I have planned for the middle of the story is keeps the story moving, and the pacing at the right speed. And then I usually know the big, the black moment and the climax. And then I don't necessarily know exactly how the story will end, but I always know it'll be happy ever after. So I try to um, have the story propel in that direction. So when I have those things figured out, I know I can start writing, but I
mhm.
try different things, I guess, along the way to see for each story what makes sense.
Right. All right. Traditional last question. Traditional last question of the podcast. When one last word is made into a movie or series, what do you think the theme song should be?
One last word. Oh my goodness. Um, that's a really good question. I don't think anybody's asked that question before. Um, it does seem like it could be of the vein of Katy Perry's Roar, but maybe not that song. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
there should be some upbeat way to end the movie, but I feel like that has been played a lot, so it would have to be something that's a little bit um probably less contemporary in terms of like just commercial, because I
Mhm.
think the character Sarah would be like, oh no, there's a Katy Perry song again. Oh, but I do think it would be of that same type of theme.
Suzanne, thank you so much for joining today. It has been a pleasure talking to you, and congratulations on the new book. It's great.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed our chat.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.